So I want to talk about the 2028 election because I think we need to start talking about that now. Today being yesterday, on the 23rd, a Republican in the House proposed legislation to amend the Constitution to allow for a president to serve a third term. And that's obviously ridiculous and terrifying at the same time. Also not very surprising. Trump has been hinting at that, talking about it, joking about it. And then when he won, it seemed kind of clear to me that he was like throwing his weight around with these Republican lawmakers to try to open them up to that idea of amending the Constitution so that he could have a third term. And it's important to note that the Republican Congress right now, it's a very slim majority, and they're not super in lockstep. So it doesn't look like the Republican House is going to be able to get all that much done necessarily. Doesn't mean they won't get anything done, or I could be wrong, because the difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Republicans actually utilize power within their party, and they eke as much out of whatever slim majority or non-majority that they have in order to get their way. And so in a situation where they have the majority, it seems clear that they can't really agree on anything right now. They can't agree on a bill for funding. You know, they're not agreeing on basic things amongst themselves at the moment. And because they have such a slim majority, that's a problem for them. So it's definitely possible that the Republican House, and therefore Congress in general, may actually be one of the weaker parts of these next 2 years of Trump's administration. The House alone might hinder a lot of the Republican agenda. Trump is pretty much going to do whatever he wants to do in the executive branch, but in situations where Trump needs legislation to be passed in order to get something that he wants, like maybe a third term, he is definitely the president that I could see, you know, pulling out all of the stops to make sure that his party votes that into law. So, you know, I would say it's just as likely as not that we could see that happen or something like it. And so we got to start talking now about what our ideal version of the 2028 election looks like. And that is a crazy thing to do because, you know, who knows what the situation is going to be at that point. It's literally possible that there won't be an election then. As crazy as that sounds, I mean, you know, when the party is talking about changing the Constitution to make it so that the current president can just get more and more terms, to me it's kind of like, you know, everything's on the table at that point. And that seems to be the case with Trump in general. It's everything's on the table. And so we got to look at what our options are. Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, also said at some point in 2023 or 2024, I'm not sure, he said that he wants to do a general strike in 2028, in May, on May Day of 2028. That's a great idea. That's the kind of thing that could help us win, or again, could help reset the conversation so that we're talking about something that, you know, can recenter us hopefully in a more positive direction. And that's not going to happen magically. It has to happen through things like, you know, labor, and through messages being spread and pressure being applied. And a general strike is a great idea. And 2028 is a long way away, but that's a long time to build momentum and build power. So now is the time to start talking about that and to start unionizing your workplace and to start looking into what unions you can join and how you can help them build. And other ways that you can help participate in a 2028 strike that could really materially make a difference. So I'm going to be following that story too, and making sure that everybody has information about what the plan is there, and hopefully it continues, and by 2028 there can be some real labor action in this country, because that's probably one of the only things that's going to save us at this point. What I don't want to see, though I don't have too much power over it, 4 years is a decent amount of time. And I don't want us, once we come to the end of this 4-year period, to be back in a situation where we've got Trump or JD Vance or whoever versus some hand-picked mainstream Democrat that the base didn't really want, and no other viable candidates. That's the last thing. That's the last position we need to find ourselves in. And so we need to talk about the different possibilities for an election where progressivism and common sense left-wing ideas like healthcare can start to take a hold again in this country and be a part of the mainstream dialogue. We need to make it so that those issues are the defining issues of the 2028 election. Healthcare, college tuition, amnesty for immigrants, and making right the atrocities that Trump is gearing up to commit. I think we should put UBI on that list as well. We haven't really talked about that in a mainstream way since Andrew Yang ran in the Democratic Party. And, you know, I think he was onto something with that. Andrew Yang has kind of disqualified himself since then. He started some third party, and, you know, we'll get to that later, but I think he is one of the, even amongst third parties, he is one of the less serious ones. But that idea of UBI and to fund it through AI profits, small tax on AI profits, which could fund the entirety of UBI. I think he was onto something with that. And I do not want to embrace the AI tech economy. That's the last thing I want. I think we should go in the other direction. But unfortunately, Trump is going to go in that direction. And so for the next 4 years, a lot of money is going to be dumped into AI technology, and who knows what's going to happen in the courts regarding copyright and things like that. There's obviously going to be a ton of corruption and a ton of government use of AI technology for just things that are more horrendous than you could even imagine, as well as the kind of thievery and grifting that we see in the AI economy today. So all of that is going to be accentuated. But to the extent that there are real applications for that technology, or, you know, ways that parts of the workforce can be replaced, we're probably going to see some of that implemented over the next 4 years. And I personally don't believe that that's sustainable at all, or that that will work. But what it needs in order to work is an insane amount of investment, essentially like endless, infinite investment forever. That's pretty much what it would take to create a sustainable economy of that kind. And you can see how the word sustainable is kind of an oxymoron in that context. And we are probably going to see an enormous amount of investment in AI under Donald Trump. At very least, he's going to take the rudders off when it comes to private money flowing into AI. And that's exactly what is happening with this new AI initiative that Trump has announced with OpenAI and other AI companies. I think it's like $500 billion that's being invested in that. Now, I think that's private investment. I do not believe that's tax dollars, which is good. I don't want my tax dollars to be spent on that. But that's probably what we're going to see. And even if we don't see endless infinite tax dollars going into AI. What we are going to see is a feeding frenzy of people investing in that, people being tricked into investing into that to the tunes of billions of dollars and all that. So it's probably going to be enough to keep this sort of like AI sham rumbling on through for the next few years. And it is possible that there could be some kind of breakthrough in technology that turns AI from what it is now, which is essentially a gimmick, and some examples of really interesting technology, to a seriously applicable new standard of technology that does put us forward in terms of how society operates. There are real questions about that in terms of how is that energy sustainable? Again, Trump is reversing all climate and energy initiatives of like the Biden administration and anything else to go strictly to coal and things that are horrible for the environment. And we're doing all this AI investment. So, I mean, the questions of how can we make this technology more sustainable are not being addressed. And especially when you think about how that's going to affect people in the workforce, creative fields, all the way to workers, regular workers, office workers, factory workers, you name it. They're going to try to apply that type of shit to everything that they can. And so I think in that type of environment, in the environment that we're going to see cropping up over the next few years, it definitely makes sense to talk about UBI as a standard platform. And that's the kind of thing that if the conditions are right, it's not inconceivable that a Republican Party would put through UBI if they were forced to. And I'm talking about under conditions completely different from what we're seeing right now. There would have to be an intense amount of disruption in many, many people's lives because of AI and other things like it, and an enormous amount of unrest over that topic, and a very clear indication that because of where technology is going, there's no going back, and a new standard needs to be reached. That's the kind of conditions where politicians in general might be forced to do something like UBI. Same was true for COVID, by the way, too. We didn't mount the right pressure in the right places when that happened, but that was also the types of conditions where gains could have been made in terms of healthcare, and we failed to seize on that moment. So I'm not saying that any of that would be easy to push for under a Republican president, let's say. But if we're talking about the 2028 election, that's where we need to start focusing on where we can apply pressure now, what issues we can apply pressure on now, and what people we can apply that pressure to that is going to push that conversation forward in a targeted way, a directed way, so that by the time we get to 2028, we have a lot of strength behind the narratives that we need to get some of these policies into the mainstream conversation. This is what Bernie Sanders did well, and guess what? This is what Donald Trump did well, too. Republicans have always been racist, but they were not talking about immigration in 2016 until Donald Trump entered the conversation. And here we are 8 years later, and Donald Trump is enacting mass deportations. He won another election by fear-mongering about immigration again. And the reason it worked the first time, it was because it was based on research. It was based on a lot of research that people like Steve Bannon and those that he was affiliated with were doing to kind of take the temperature of the populace in terms of what issues were important to them and what issues they found emotionally animating. That's the type of work that Cambridge Analytica and the organizations and the people that created that program, what they were working on before it became what it became in 2016. They were working on ways to profile people and find out what people cared about and the best ways to reach people with emotional information. And immigration was the issue that it led them to. That was something that was animating to people, and that you could provide a lot of images that would make people act, that would get people to go and vote. That was the theory, and the theory turned out to be true. And that theory was channeled through Donald Trump and stuff like drain the swamp and build the wall. These were slogans that were developed before Donald Trump ran. And we don't normally think about it that way, but it's true. These were focus groups, and the right people were able to get that stuff to Donald Trump in a way that he sort of absorbed and rolled with, and that became the campaign message. And he was the best person to deliver that message, and that's what Steve Bannon saw in him. And again, that turned out to be correct. That calculation on his part turned out to be correct. So we've got to narrow down what are the issues that not just are important to us, but in conversation and in practice could be transformative for the political conversation in America. And we need to start talking about those issues every day and starting to be creative about how we can push those issues to the people we know and make it something that other people care about, and how we can bring to the attention of people in power that and build momentum behind that, so that once 2028 happens, we can have a real grip on what the narrative is. And frankly, whether it's a Democrat or whether it's a third party, we know that there is a certain core demand that is pressuring and animating whoever the candidate is that ends up challenging Donald Trump in 2028. And so to talk a little bit about third parties, because I think that's an important part of this conversation, I'm all for a third party, and I would vote for a third party candidate in 2028 if I felt like it was a realistic chance that it would prevent a Republican from being in power. And the conversation that I want to try to prevent us from having to have again is whether or not it makes sense to vote for a Democrat over a Republican. Because, and I'm not saying that through vote blue no matter who, we can convince everybody that voting for Democrats is the right way. I'm talking about the opposite. I'm talking about how can we lay the groundwork so that we know whether it's the blue party or the green party or the purple party, whoever the candidate is that has momentum in 2028 is going to be one who is aligned with the issues that we care about, like healthcare and getting money out of politics and that sort of thing. And I do think that it's possible for that to happen within the Democratic Party. And while I would say that Bernie Sanders, to an extent, proved that it could happen, he also proved the reasons why it's not likely to happen. And so we got to do two things at once. We have to look very carefully at the Democratic Party and try to see what would a version of this in 2028 look like that could elect a halfway decent candidate as the nominee. Where would pressure have to be applied in order for that to be possible? And what would the candidate have to look like? Who would that candidate be? Is it Tim Walz? It might be. I think Tim Walz would be an interesting choice. We'll see. He may have used up his political capital for the moment, but I think if we're talking about Democrats that are a good chance not only to beat the Republicans, but to bring some fucking good policies into the White House if it still stands at that point, I think Tim Walz would be the brand of Democrat that we should be looking at. And that's the kind of candidate that you can push issues through. Maybe there's been a lot of things that he has done in Minnesota that have been really good. There may be other ideas that he hasn't done in Minnesota that he could be open to, like UBI. Like I said, if the conditions change in this country, which they are likely to, where we can start having conversations about something like that, and it undeniably makes sense. So while we're doing that on the Democratic side, we also have to look at the third parties that we want to be viable in 2028 and figure out what we need to do to make sure that these parties are viable, so that we're not in a position where there are 3 or 4 or 1 third party candidates that serve no purpose other than essentially making it easier for Republicans to win. And it works the other way too. The other thing that we could do is try to figure out how to set up third parties to be spoilers for the Republicans. That's what RFK was doing, and that's why he had so much leverage with Trump, is he would have taken votes away from Trump if he had stayed in the election. And so he actually made a pretty smart play. And those are the kinds of things that as of right now, third parties are capable of doing. Right now, they don't seem to be capable of winning a national election. And if we want that to happen, if we're done with Democrats and we're not going to entertain that anymore, okay, great. But the time to talk about that is not 2 months away from the election. The time to talk about it is now. Who are the candidates? Who are the candidates? How are we going to get them across the finish line? If we're going with Green Party, guess what? I don't think Jill Stein is the one, okay? I really don't. I think that her political credibility is at 0, in my personal opinion. And there's plenty of people that voted for her over Kamala. And so, look, if she ends up being the one who has a lot of momentum and there's a chance that she can actually win and not just put us in a worse position, then I would vote for Jill Stein. But we gotta start talking about what that platform is. Because just like we can't do vote blue no matter who, any Democrat, we also just can't do anybody but a Democrat. We've got to do everything we can now to try to get a decent fucking person on the ballot against Republicans in 2028 so that we have a chance at a country that at least still has a semblance of ability to serve its people and continue going in a positive direction. Because if we give up the 2028 election now, there's probably going to be an election either way. It might be rigged. It might be rigged for Trump so that he wins, 700 electoral votes. But the election's probably going to happen. This is kind of like Brazil with like Lula and Bolsonaro. It's getting to that point where it's like president serves his term, gets arrested, goes to jail, fascist comes to power, does a bunch of fascist shit, tries to do a coup to stay in power, fails, socialist wins again, is now the president. Who knows what's going to happen next in Brazil? And America's starting to look a lot like that. So we want to be able to wrestle power back from these fascists, one way or the other. And the election isn't the only component of that. It may very well be a non-factor at this point, but it's probably not. It's probably something that it's probably the main opportunity that we are going to have to change the power system in this country, short of some kind of spontaneous revolution. And I'm all there for that, and that's a different topic for a different day. But just in case the revolution doesn't happen, let's turn our eyes towards 2028 now to see if we can dig ourselves out of hell.